In this episode, we're going to take the idea of conditional access and turn it into something you can reason about calmly, because it can sound like a complicated policy engine when you first hear it. The simplest way to think about conditional access is that it changes the question from who are you to who are you, and under what conditions are you allowed to act right now. That shift matters in cloud security because credentials are stolen, devices get compromised, and locations are spoofed, so relying on identity alone is often not enough. At the same time, beginners sometimes assume that stronger access controls automatically mean worse usability, as if security must always punish the user. The reality is that conditional access can be designed to be both safer and smoother, especially when it is applied to the right actions and tuned to real risk. Our goal is to explain what conditional access is, why it matters, and how you enforce it in patterns that reduce risk without turning daily work into constant friction. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to separate identity proof from access decision, because conditional access lives in that decision layer. Authentication establishes an identity, often by asking for a password, and then additional proof like multi-factor authentication, MFA. Authorization decides what that identity can do, usually through IAM roles and policies. Conditional access adds context to the authorization decision, which means the same identity with the same permissions might be allowed in one situation and blocked or challenged in another. That can feel strange at first because people like rules that are always true, but it is actually a realistic response to modern threat conditions. A stolen password might be enough to authenticate, but context can help reveal that something is off, like an unfamiliar device or a risky network. When you see conditional access as context-aware authorization, it becomes easier to reason about where it helps and where it can create unintended frustration. Conditional access matters in public cloud because the cloud control plane is reachable from many places, and that reachability turns identity abuse into a major risk. If an attacker steals credentials, the attacker can often attempt to sign in from anywhere and immediately begin making management actions, such as listing resources or changing access. Traditional network-based defenses do not reliably protect management interfaces in the same way they might protect a private internal system, because cloud management is designed to be accessible. Conditional access becomes a compensating control by limiting the circumstances under which cloud access is accepted, even when credentials are correct. It also supports the idea of zero trust, ZT, which is the mindset that you should not automatically trust a request just because it comes from inside a familiar environment. Instead, you continuously evaluate trust based on identity, device, location, and risk signals. In that model, conditional access is one of the practical levers you can use to turn ZT from a slogan into enforceable behavior. To enforce conditional access patterns effectively, you need to understand the kinds of signals that are commonly used, because enforcement is only as good as the signals it relies on. Identity signals include whether the account is privileged, whether the sign-in is interactive or automated, and whether the user has recently completed strong authentication like MFA. Device signals include whether the device is managed, whether it meets security posture requirements, and whether it is known and compliant. Location signals include whether the request originates from expected regions or from networks you trust. Behavioral signals can include unusual sign-in patterns, impossible travel indicators, or sign-ins that deviate from normal timing and usage patterns. The key beginner lesson is that signals are not perfect truths, they are risk indicators, so your policies should be designed to handle uncertainty. A strong pattern uses multiple signals and focuses strict enforcement on the most risky actions, rather than treating every sign-in like a crisis. A common beginner mistake is to implement conditional access as a blunt instrument, such as requiring maximum friction for every user in every scenario. That approach can reduce risk in a narrow sense, but it often creates usability pain that leads to workarounds, and workarounds usually create new risk. People might shift work to unmanaged devices, share credentials, or create overly broad service accounts to avoid interactive prompts. The more sustainable approach is to match controls to risk, applying strict conditions to privileged access and sensitive actions while keeping low-risk access smoother. For example, a read-only dashboard might tolerate less friction than a role that can change access policies. When you think this way, usability becomes part of security rather than a competitor to it, because a usable control is one that people actually follow. Conditional access succeeds when it makes the safe path the easiest path. One of the most effective patterns is to distinguish between everyday access and privileged access, because privileged access has a higher blast radius and deserves stronger conditions. Everyday access might include reading documentation, viewing logs, or performing routine tasks within narrow roles. Privileged access includes actions like modifying IAM roles, changing network exposure, disabling monitoring, or managing secrets. Conditional access can enforce stronger requirements for privileged actions, such as requiring MFA every time, requiring a compliant managed device, and restricting access to known locations or approved networks. This reduces the chance that a stolen password alone can be used to perform catastrophic actions. It also reduces the chance that a compromised personal device becomes the path to admin control. When you apply stricter conditions to privileged roles rather than to everyone equally, you limit risk where it matters most while keeping the broader workforce productive. Another important pattern is adaptive challenge, which means you do not always block risky access, but you step up verification when risk signals rise. Stepping up might involve requiring MFA, requiring a stronger factor, or requiring access from a managed device. This is useful because risk is not constant, and a fixed set of requirements can be either too strict or too weak, depending on the situation. Adaptive challenge can keep usability reasonable by allowing normal workflows to proceed smoothly when signals are low risk, while still protecting you when something unusual happens. A beginner misunderstanding is assuming that adaptive controls are unpredictable and therefore confusing, but they can be made understandable with clear rules and consistent user messaging. The key is to avoid constant random prompts and instead tie challenges to meaningful changes, like signing in from a new device or attempting a high-impact action. When designed well, adaptive challenge feels like a seatbelt that engages when needed rather than a permanent obstacle. You also need conditional access patterns for non-human access, because cloud environments depend heavily on service identities, automation, and workloads. Human-focused controls like interactive MFA do not apply to service accounts in the same way. So conditional access for services often relies on different signals and different constraints. Good patterns include restricting where service identities can be used, limiting them to specific environments, and requiring that they operate only through approved execution contexts. If a service identity's credentials are stolen, you want policies that prevent their use from arbitrary locations or by arbitrary clients. This is part of limiting risk without killing usability because automated systems must run reliably, and the goal is to make automation predictable while still constraining misuse. A common weak pattern is to treat service identities as exceptions that bypass controls entirely, which can turn them into the easiest path for attackers. Strong conditional access design treats automation as critical infrastructure that deserves tight, purpose-driven constraints. Enforcement also depends on good role hygiene, because conditional access cannot compensate for wildly over-permissioned identities. If an identity has broad administrative permissions, then any successful sign-in carries huge risk, even if it is constrained by device or location. Least privilege reduces the consequences of a conditional access failure, which is important because no control is perfect. Conditional access and least privilege therefore work together. Conditional access reduces the chance of unauthorized use, and least privilege reduces the impact if unauthorized use occurs. This is why exam scenarios often combine these topics, even if they present them separately. When you evaluate a situation, ask whether conditional access is being used to protect a role that is already tightly scoped, or whether it is being used as a bandage for overly broad access. Bandages can help, but they are not a substitute for a healthy design. A practical usability strategy is to group access decisions by sensitivity and to design user experiences that feel consistent. If users are prompted for additional verification constantly and unpredictably, they will view the control as broken. If users experience a predictable pattern, such as stronger checks for admin actions and smoother access for routine work, they will adapt quickly and stop fighting the system. Predictability is also a security feature because it reduces the temptation to create exceptions and reduces the number of support incidents that lead to shortcuts. You should also think about the human cost of false positives, where legitimate users are blocked due to noisy signals, because that can pressure teams into loosening controls too far. A mature enforcement approach includes feedback loops, where policy outcomes are reviewed and tuned so that the control remains strict where it matters and reasonable where it does not. That tuning is how you limit risk without killing usability over time. Conditional access can also enforce boundaries between environments, which is especially useful in cloud where development and production are often separated by accounts, subscriptions, or projects. For example, you might allow broader access to development environments from a wider range of devices and locations, while requiring stricter conditions for production access. This supports both security and delivery because developers can iterate quickly in lower-risk spaces, while production remains guarded by stronger controls. The key is to make sure that identities used for development do not automatically grant production access, and conditional access can reinforce that separation by applying different conditions to different environments and roles. If an attacker compromises a developer account, conditional access can help prevent that compromise from reaching production, especially if production access requires managed devices and strong authentication. When you pair environment separation with conditional policies, boundaries become more durable under pressure. Monitoring is another essential piece of enforcement because conditional access policies are only as effective as your ability to see outcomes and respond to failures. You want visibility into sign-in attempts, blocked actions, stepped-up challenges, and policy exceptions. High rates of blocked attempts can indicate credential stuffing or targeted attack activity, while sudden patterns of successful sign-ins from unusual contexts can indicate a compromised account that slipped through. Monitoring also helps you detect when users are struggling, which is a usability signal that your policies might be too strict or poorly aligned to real workflows. The goal is not to chase every event, but to build a mental model of what normal looks like and to treat deviations as prompts for investigation. Enforcement becomes stronger when it is paired with operational attention, because attackers test boundaries repeatedly, and persistent testing creates patterns you can observe. When you treat conditional access as part of a monitored system rather than a static rule set, you improve both security outcomes and user experience. A subtle but important concept is that conditional access must be designed to resist bypass, because attackers will look for the easiest route. If your policies apply to interactive user sign-in but do not apply to API access, legacy protocols, or certain service pathways, attackers will target those weaker paths. Similarly, if some roles are exempt, or if some environments are unmanaged, those become the soft spots where compromise turns into escalation. The enforcement mindset should be to reduce inconsistent coverage, because inconsistency creates opportunities. This does not mean you can make every pathway equally strict, but it does mean you should understand where the gaps are and how they could be abused. For exam purposes, scenarios that mention exceptions, legacy access paths, or inconsistent enforcement often imply a boundary weakness. A strong answer will recognize that conditional access must be comprehensive enough that attackers cannot simply step around it. As we close, enforcing conditional access patterns that limit risk without killing usability is about applying context-aware decisions in a way that aligns with real threat behavior and real human workflows. Conditional access adds signals like device posture, location, and risk indicators to the access decision, so stolen credentials are less likely to work. The strongest patterns apply strict conditions to privileged actions and sensitive environments while keeping routine work smoother, because that combination reduces both attack success and user resistance. Effective enforcement includes controls for human identities and service identities, and it is paired with least privilege, so any failure has limited impact. Usability is protected through predictability, sensible step-up challenges, and tuning based on observed outcomes, not by weakening controls until they no longer matter. When you can reason about conditional access this way, You can spot designs that truly reduce blast radius and designs that merely add friction without meaningful protection, which is exactly the distinction the exam wants you to make.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.